Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk more about the ongoing expansion of Islam and Islamic influence during this period of the 8th century and into the 9th century and the establishment of Islamic culture. Now, I mentioned that despite the great successes that the Islamic armies coming out of Arabia had enjoyed fighting against the Persians and the Byzantines, I also mentioned there were significant challenges that were facing the leaders of Islam at this time. And we start to see during this period a growing division within the Islamic community. And this is a division that will solidify into the two main branches of Islam, that is Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. So for Sunni Muslims, authority and the authority necessary to lead Islam comes from whoever is best at offering prayers to Allah. And so this had been the basis by which Abu Bakr had been selected as Muhammad's successor as the first caliph. For Shia Muslims, the authority of the caliph was based on their biological connections to the Prophet Muhammad. And so this meant the successor, the person who should become the new caliph, should be the person who was most closely related to the Prophet Muhammad. And so after Muhammad's death, the two groups had agreed on Abu Bakr. But then Abu Bakr dies and is replaced by the new caliph named Umar. And Umar is the candidate of the Sunni Muslims, but the Shia Muslims feel as though they've been a little marginalized here because Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, has been passed over. And this happens again when Umar dies and is replaced by the next great early Islamic caliph named Uthman. When Uthman dies, there's basically a struggle for power between the Sunnis and the Shias. And the Shias win. Ali becomes the caliph, but then he is assassinated. And then there's another outbreak of war and fighting, and eventually the new caliph is Muawiyah, and Muawiyah is the candidate of the Sunni Muslims. Muawiyah is significant because he's the first caliph who's not accepted by Shia Islam and by Shia Muslims. And from this point, the two branches of Islam are kind of going to go their separate ways. You have those that accept Muawiyah and his descendants who establish a biological dynasty called the Umayyad dynasty and have their capital, the center of their power, in the Syrian city of Damascus. And the fact that the center of Islam has now moved from Arabia to Syria is a sign of the expansion of Islam. So those are Sunni Muslims. Authority to lead Islam comes from who is best at offering prayers to Allah, but that's kind of been solidified in this dynasty called the Umayyad dynasty, the ruling dynasty. And Sunni Muslims make up the majority of Muslims. Nevertheless, Shia Muslims make up a significant minority. For them, the authority to lead Islam comes from your biological proximity to the Prophet Muhammad, how closely you are related to Muhammad. And they refuse to accept Muawiyah. So now we have this division within Islam between Sunni and Shia Muslims who don't accept the same leaders. Despite these divisions, Islam continues to advance, but during this period, during the period of the early 8th century, we start to see the first defeats of Islam. And these defeats will kind of set the boundaries for Islamic expansion. This first defeat takes place outside the walls of Constantinople. Muslims have been very successful defeating the Byzantines in open battle, but coming from the deserts of Arabia, they're less used to conducting sieges. They try and lay siege to the city of Constantinople, designed by Constantine to be built in a highly defensible location surrounded by water, and the Muslim fleets and armies are unable to totally seal off the city, and they end up getting defeated by the Byzantines. So this means the Byzantine Empire will survive and will provide a bulwark for Europe and Eastern Europe against the threat of Islamic invasion. Islam, however, continues to expand further south to the west. Islamic armies conquer the Roman province of North Africa and then conquer most of Spain. So they conquer about 3/4 of Spain, and the surviving members of the Visigoth tribe or the Visigoth people who had ruled Spain after the fall of the Roman Empire, who won't accept Islamic rule, flee into the mountains of northern Spain. Eventually, they make themselves annoying enough that the Muslim rulers of Spain send out an army to defeat them. But here, the Visigothic Christians win a battle. Again, it kind of seems like a miraculous victory. It's certainly an improbable victory, fighting in the mountains against the invading Muslim armies, and they manage to defeat them at the Battle of Covadonga. Now, the immediate results or the immediate implications of this battle are not great. All it means is that these Christian holdouts, outlaws, if you will, can continue to govern themselves and to resist being ruled by Muslim leaders. But the Muslims still dominate the Spanish peninsula. The Battle of Covadonga's significance is going to be more long-term, because it helps sustain this historical memory of a united Christian Spain. The Visigoths are going to kind of keep alive and going to be able to promote in the centuries to come. So that's the second major Islamic defeat. Constantinople, Covadonga, and the third one takes place at the Battle of Tours. So this shows you that the short-term effects of the Battle of Covadonga were minimal, that Islamic armies continue to expand, this time into the modern-day Kingdom of France that was ruled by the Franks. And eventually they are defeated by the armies led by a man named Charles Martel, and we'll talk more about him in future weeks. But again, this battle is significant because it establishes the boundaries of Islamic expansion. Islam has established a great empire that spans much of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but it's not going to restore all the territories of the Roman Empire and reunite all those territories. And it means that the history of medieval Europe, which is the society that we're going to study, or the medieval world, I should say, which is the society that we're going to study for the rest of this course, is made up of three civilizations. The Byzantine Empire, which is older and smaller, but an important in maintaining the structures of the ancient Roman Empire. The Islamic civilization, to the south of the Mediterranean and to the Middle East, and then to the north, medieval European civilization. Which we're going to talk about more in the next weeks. And so that's why these early Islamic defeats, these first Islamic defeats, are so important, because they establish the boundaries of these three civilizations. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the culture of the Islamic world at this time. So, although Islamic armies are conquering and taking over large parts of the Middle East, most of the populations of these areas are not Muslim at this point. Now, a significant population are going to convert to Islam eventually, but this doesn't happen right away. And although in some of the early history of Islam, especially when Islam is confined to Arabia, we have instances of Muslim leaders insisting that the inhabitants of the land they ruled either convert to Islam or die, it's just not possible in this situation. The number of Christian and the number of Jewish people who are under Islamic rule and in Islamic territories is just too large. And so instead, we find Muslims, Christians, and Jews coming to a point of accommodation. And so the Christians and Jews under Islam have a status that's called a dhimmi status, D-H-I-M-M-I. And this means they are people of the book. So they are part of this story of the revelation of God to humans that is acknowledged by Muslims. So God reveals himself to Abraham, to Jesus, who is a prophet in the Islamic tradition, and finally to Muhammad. And Muslims hold the fullness of that teaching, the fullness of that revelation. But the idea is that Christians and Jews have accepted part of it, and therefore they can be accepted in Islamic society up to a point, or with certain conditions. Those conditions being, they're not allowed to practice their faith openly, they're not allowed to convert other people to their faith, and they have to pay an additional level of tax each year. And so this is the negotiated accommodation between the new Muslim rulers of the Middle East and the Mediterranean and their Christian and Jewish subjects. Now, the Umayyad dynasty, the descendants of Muawiyah, continued to rule this vast Islamic empire for another 20 or 30 years or so. But increasingly, the non-Arab Muslims in this population are dissatisfied or resent the rule of this Arab dynasty. And so in 750, a new dynasty called the Abbasid Dynasty overthrows the Umayyads. They overthrow the Umayyads, they defeat them, and they kill almost all of them, and then they establish their own new capital city, and it's in the city of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. And this is important because it marks another shift, in focus in the Islamic world. The movement of the capital from Medina in Arabia to Damascus in Syria reflects the expansion of Islamic influence into the Mediterranean. The movement of the capital from Damascus in Syria to Baghdad in Iraq shows that the focus of the Islamic world and Islamic culture is now shifting to the east. That Islamic culture is now going to be much more interested in Asia and the cultures of Asia than in Europe and in the Mediterranean. Before we close this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture of the Islamic world. What we see in the centuries that follow, so from about 750 to 950, is a flourishing of a highly sophisticated culture, probably the most sophisticated culture in Western civilization at this time. And we see the success of the Islamic world in incorporating the cultural achievements of the Romans, the Greeks, ancient India, and ancient China. All of these cultures and all of these cultural achievements come together. We see this in the pottery that's developed and melding together the best practices of these different civilizations. We see this in the architecture that is built, and we see it in agricultural practices. For example, we see best practices in agriculture in the Middle East being transposed to Spain. And we see North African agricultural practices being transposed to the Middle East. So these are immense and really important successes of Islamic civilization. And we see this most notably in education, where all the intellectual resources of these four great ancient cultures, Greece, Rome, Persia, I forgot to mention that, so 5 cultures, Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and China, are all being successfully incorporated and maintained in Islamic culture at a time when, because of the instability following the fall of the Roman Empire, they might not have been maintained in Europe. Well, they were not maintained in Europe. And so this means that Baghdad, the capital of the Islamic Empire, the capital of the Abbasid Dynasty at this time, becomes a vital center for the study of medicine, science, mathematics, and literature. And a vital center of production for all these disciplines, and a vital center for the advancement of all these disciplines. We also see some philosophical achievements produced by Islamic culture. There are a number of notable Islamic philosophers that emerge at this time. The philosophical achievements of Islam, however, come with a bit of an asterisk. And that's because of the theology of Islam, philosophy was always viewed with suspicion. And learning that wasn't learning for the sake of better practicing Islam was viewed with suspicion. And so the problem is that eventually this will impose kind of a technological ceiling on what Islamic culture will achieve, and eventually it will be surpassed by other cultures. But what's important to remember is that for the moment, in the 8th and the 9th centuries, this is a vital center of learning. It's the leading center of learning, certainly in Western civilization and in most places throughout the world.